Welcome to the Gardner Innovation Search Partners podcast, where we delve into the world of academic research leadership with the brilliant minds and trailblazers of academic research administration at universities around the world. My name is Quentin Thomas, and I'm co-founder of Chat with Leaders Media. Today, we have as our guest Professor Raghupathy Sivakumar, Vice President of Commercialization and Chief Commercialization Officer at Georgia Tech. Siva, thanks for joining us.
Quentin, thanks for having me. Super excited to do this.
I'm excited to have you on and share with our audience the great things going on at Georgia Tech. And you know what, just to kick off, your role is Chief Commercialization Officer, and that title, or the title of Chief Innovation Officer in some places, is a fairly new role to higher education. Could you tell us how did that role come about at Georgia Tech, and maybe even just a little bit in general what you see about that role developing in academia?
Yeah, absolutely, Quentin. I'll start with the broader response of what I see happening in academia. If you roll back like 400 years, right, when one of the first universities in the US came along, universities happened to be knowledge sharing centers, right? So people would come to universities would teach students who are enrolled. And then a couple of hundred years later, in the 1800s, universities like Johns Hopkins came along, where universities sort of evolved to not just doing knowledge sharing, but also knowledge discovery, where research became a big focus area for universities. I really think there is the next stage of evolution actively happening right now in academia, where universities are increasingly becoming aware that they need to be custodians of impact. We have this amazing talent that we are developing. We have this incredible innovation through our research labs that's happening. We shouldn't just outsource the impact through this talent and innovation to beyond the walls of the university. And how do we enable impact more actively, right? So I see this happening, and hopefully 50 years down the road, we can look back at this juncture and say, yes, that was the time where universities sort of took on this third dimension of being impact centers. So with that broad framing, Georgia Tech, I am really, really proud to say that has been sort of on the frontiers of taking better control of being an impact center. And so a lot of the functions, and I'm sure we'll get into it, existed at Georgia Tech in different sort of home units. But a few years ago, leadership at Georgia Tech sort of brought together all these units into a single organization, which is the Office of Commercialization that I lead right now, with the specific purpose of how do we take a real concerted shot at enabling our talent and innovation to have impact in the real world.
That's great. And I love how you talk about the evolution of academia and its role in society in general. And this becoming like a natural next evolution. And you guys are on the front end of that as well. So talking about that evolution in its current state at Georgia Tech, what are the units that report to you, and how does each contribute to fostering that commercialization and entrepreneurship at Georgia Tech?
Yeah, I tend to look at the commercialization and entrepreneurship ecosystem at Georgia Tech as two halves. There is our student entrepreneurship focus, and the unit in my organization that directly deals with student entrepreneurship is called CreateX. CreateX is about a 10-year-old effort at Georgia Tech. And I was the founding director for CreateX 10 years ago, and the platform has grown tremendously. We work with thousands of students a year, and last year launched over 100 startups founded by our students. So that's sort of the student entrepreneurship piece. There are other resources for student entrepreneurship on campus, but CreateX is one of the largest. And then on the research commercialization side, we have two units. The Office of Technology Licensing, which manages all of our intellectual property. So the moment a Georgia Tech employee or a researcher comes up with something that could be seen as an invention, they would come to the Office of Tech Licensing and request OTL to file for IP protection, and we would take that request all the way from filing provisional patent applications to getting it granted and eventually licensing it to startups or to existing companies. So OTL is part of my organization as well. So this is all of our IP management. And then we have a relatively new unit called Quadranti. So Quadranti works directly with our faculty and our researchers, helping them launch startups that are based on Georgia Tech IP. So the difference between CreateX and Quadranti is CreateX works with students. We typically don't own the IP that the students are working on, it's theirs, but we're helping them launch startups. Quadranti, on the other hand, is working with Georgia Tech faculty and researchers in launching ventures that are based on Georgia Tech IP. So these are sort of the three main functional units. We do have an amazing unit called VentureLab, which is also part of my organization. VentureLab is sort of our teaching, training, uh, tool development, and research arm of commercialization. And so VentureLab ends up working with CreateX, it ends up working with OTL, it ends up working with Quadranti, and is focused on how do we teach faculty and students about entrepreneurship and commercialization. How do we do research into what I would characterize as the science of commercialization, and also we partner with other universities in the country, helping them set up their own commercialization ecosystems. All that is provided through this unit called Venture Lab. So these are the four units that are directly part of the Office of Commercialization. But the Georgia Tech entrepreneurship and commercialization ecosystem is much broader and richer beyond just these four units. And so one of the things that we do as the Office of Commercialization is serve as that central hub or resource that brings together all the different units that exist on campus and make sure that they're all working together and enabling collaborations between all the resources that exist on campus.
So CreateX, Office of Technology, Licensing, Quadrant I, and Venture Lab. That's awesome. And I think you said that CreateX has launched over 100 startups. Is that what you said?
We've actually done over 500 startups. The
500.
100 was
Wow.
just last year. So we are at a rate of about 100 startups a year. We, in the short term, our goal is to get to about 300 startups a year founded by our students. And we are very hopeful that we can get that.
Well, that's amazing. So I want to say congratulations on that too. And also I'm familiar with Tech Transfer. I know that Mary Albertson is the director of the technology licensing there, and I was a member of Autumn. I know she has a great background, past president of Autumn, a great career at Stanford and University of Utah, and so in this four-pronged strategy that you have going on at Georgia Tech, how are you seeing like areas where they converge or collaborate or fostering synergies to maximize their impact in the ecosystem?
That's a great question, Quentin. I mentioned till recently, till a few years ago, these units existed, but in different homes. And one of the challenges was exactly what you're asking, which is how do these units really collaborate and how do we leverage the synergies that exist? And because they're all now part of the same organization, we work incredibly well and closely with each other. I'll give you a few examples. What CreateX is nurturing is entrepreneurial talent, right? So we are training our students to be entrepreneurs. And yes, a lot of the times the students will come up with their own ideas and they'll want to launch ventures based on their ideas, but they don't need to be restricted just to their ideas. They could take intellectual property that Georgia Tech owns through Office of Tech Licensing and launch ventures based on Georgia Tech IP, right? So they're right there. There is a collaboration, which is how do we enable our students to be agents of commercialization for Georgia Tech IP, right? And that's something CreateX and OTL work together on. The other way around is true as well, which is yes, we don't directly support our students on intellectual property. We won't expend resources because the IP belongs to them. But we are a resource, though, right? So students, when They're like, hey, I have a question about IP. Mary would be very happy to talk to them and give them counsel, right? So the other way around is true as well, which is we providing resources to our students to understand issues around IP. One of the things that we actually host is this series called Legal Buzz, where we get IP lawyers from in and around Atlanta to come and hold free office hours to our students, right? Where they walk in and they can ask questions about IP. So that's CreateX and OTL. Because sometimes students can be agents of commercialization, they get engaged with Quadranti as well, because now there's Georgia Tech IP that's being launched as a ventures, and Quadranti is right there as a resource to help. And then VentureLab, because VentureLab does a lot of teaching and training, ends up working with faculty members, helping them understand entrepreneurial methodologies and how they can put that to use to research commercialization. And then VentureLab also builds tools that helps accelerate our commercialization efforts. So these are a few examples of how these units work together. I could spend the next hour talking about every single point of collaboration, but I think your question is spot on. It's critical that even though these four units have slightly different focus areas, that they continue to work together closely so that we can be more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, I love that. And I think earlier you said something about even I think was it Venture Lab that also works with other institutions and
Mhm.
helping them as well too. And I think there's a lot that people can learn from, and whether it be in academia or in other areas too, about creating these synergies and having these areas covered and overlapping where more impact can be made as well. So just to wrap it up and start to bring it all home, like whenever you're with all these things you're doing with these different pronged strategies, this four-tiered strategy here, what is the overarching mission of your efforts in commercialization at Georgia Tech, and how do you plan to address the challenges in academia's approach to commercialization?
A great question. I'll give you a two-part answer to it. Looking at it through the broadest lens, we are approaching commercialization, Quentin, with this perspective that commercialization in academia is still largely an unsolved problem. That's a pretty humble position to take, right, for an Office of Commercialization, but we are excited about it, right? We are not intimidated by that question. We think if Georgia Tech can figure out commercialization at the scale that we are envisioning, it can transform not just Georgia Tech, but how commercialization is done within academia as a whole, right? And so to this end, we have a very research oriented mindset for everything that we do. So we run a lot of experiments to see what has the potential to unlock the commercialization potential that exists. We actually have an effort called the Science of Commercialization. We are actually working with researchers trying to understand some of the fundamental questions around commercialization. So that's the broad lens, right? Which is commercialization is unsolved. How do we solve it? Specifically, we think we can launch 1,000 startups from within Georgia Tech. It's going to take us time to get there. We are at about 100 right now, if you include both student startups and faculty and research startups. So we need to grow tenfold. But if we do that, then I think in the journey to get there, we would have solved the commercialization and academia problem, right? 1,000 startups, we think we can get there in within the next 10 years.
Wow, 1,000 startups in the next 10 years. I love it, and I love that statement. Academic commercialization is unsolved. How can we solve it? And it's a very clear mission, very focused mission. So just to close out, one last question: what sets Georgia Tech apart in terms of its approach to innovation and entrepreneurship, and what would you like to leave our audience with in their minds when they think about Georgia Tech?
So, our Georgia Tech mission statement is to develop leaders that advance technology and the human condition, right? So, right there in the mission statement is our motivation to create impact to real people, right? So that to me is very unique, and in what our mission is. And we are a public university, and we are actually one of the fastest growing public universities in the country, and we are one of the largest research universities that don't have a medical school. In fact, from a research budget standpoint, we are the largest non-medical university in the country, and we do a lot of research that matters, right? And so then the Office of Commercialization role is pronounced, because if you're doing research that matters, then we are the vehicle to get that research out to real people. Um, there has never been a more exciting time at Georgia Tech for entrepreneurship and commercialization, and I'm just thrilled to be part of this ecosystem at this point.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And I'm excited to see all that's going to be coming out of Georgia Tech. I know, being a Metro Atlanta resident, not that I'm in the city, the success of academic institutions in our city will also impact the city as well. And so I'm very excited for it as well. Siva, thank you for joining us on the Gardner Innovation Search Partners podcast. It's been a pleasure learning about you, your role, and all the innovative strategies Georgia Tech is taking to foster innovation, commercialization, and entrepreneurship. I mean, from CreateX to Quadranti, VentureLab, Office of Technology Licensing, and all that's bringing together, as well as the goal of launching 1,000 startups in the next 10 years. I'm sure I'll still be around in the next 10 years, so I look forward to celebrating that 1,000 startups with you all as well, too. For our listeners interested in learning more about the initiatives Siva discussed today, as well as other work being done at Georgia Tech, check out the show notes in the description below. And you can learn more about Gardner Innovation Search Partners at gardnerisp.com. Thanks again, Siva.
Thanks, Quentin. Thanks for having me, and thanks to Gardner. They've been a really, really important partner to us as we've been growing our team. So thank you as well.